All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Thursday. Usually Calvin shows me the last slide on the last day. I appreciate the promotional upgrade, Calvin. I'm going to talk about Python's web story, and I'm a developer advocate, and we are getting coached these days to give more clickbaity YouTube titles. And so I briefly considered renaming this to Why Do You Hate the Web as my talk title. And when I say that, I kid. It's over the line, I know, but I'm kidding. Or am I? Because each word in this sentence actually means something, including the punctuation mark. And that'll be what we talk about a little bit today. I'm Paul Everitt, developer advocate at JetBrains. I cover Python and web stuff. I have the best job in the world for the best company in the world. I joke that I should be paying them, but don't tell them I said that. I'm also a girls lacrosse coach, fastest sport on 2 feet, had our first game last night in the rain, spring sport. I am a Python oldster. You may know that I put those years in really small fonts because I used to give talks. Python 1994 is a keynote that I give about the first meetup in 1994. And in my talk, I would say, what were you doing in 1994? Well, when the answer became waiting to be conceived, I decided I'm not going to ask that question anymore. I am also a web originalist, and that is a phrase that will be kind of the center of my thesis in this talk. We'll come back to it. I did www.navy.mil in 1993, a source of infinite funny stories, including this one. This is the first evidence of Pauly on the interwebs. I asked a tech support question about compiling. Look who answered my question. Let's just say our lives went in different directions after this interaction. All right, today's talk has a thesis. Python, really successful. I think I saw again last week, like every month or so, something. Okay, now that in the channel, Chris, that's just too much. Wait, is that me? Okay. The success has been phenomenal. Just in the last week or two, we saw another survey where Python's #1 again in programming languages. And where does the success come from? I view it as a three-legged stool. The initial success was in web stuff. We'll say Django and full stack web. And then there was this big surge a number of years ago with data science. And now it seems like everybody in the Python community showed up about 7 minutes ago. 110% of the people have been using Python for less than a day. And then there's this third stool. We'll call it other. Maybe it's sysadmin or scraping or automation or something like that. So that's one part of the thesis. But there's this antithesis part, which is JavaScript is taking over or has taken over the front end of web stuff. And I'll explain what that means in the next slide. And well, maybe it just won't be happy with taking over the front end. I heard an expression recently that someone gets hungrier as they eat. And so maybe JavaScript will start taking over the back end too. A lot of stuff happening on that front. And so my question is, should we care? Now, what do I mean by this about JavaScript taking over the front end? The UI used to be on the server, and we would send HTML to the browser. Now the UI is in the browser. It's written in a language that runs in the browser, not on the server. And let's look through some generations of this to see how this has all happened. Make sure that we have kind of a shared understanding of the facts before we get into some spicy hot takes. I'm going through an analysis from Igor Minar, who put out a blog post at this URL. Was it this weekend or last week? Very widely distributed, really important blog post. He is, and we'll talk about him in a moment, was team lead for Angular for a long time. And he's now at Cloudflare. And he talks about Generation 0 is kind of classic multi-page architecture, what I lovingly refer to as the web. And prior to 2010, JavaScript was only used for like decorating some things. All logic and state, all the important stuff, the rendering was on the server. For us, it was in Python. Now, what was wrong in the happy garden? Latency. Every time you wanted a form validation trip to the server, and then you get a repaint. And as you started to put some more JavaScript in there, hey, that's an HTMX. Yeah, that came from HTMX Twitter. Yeah. As you start to put more JavaScript in the front end, you have the two languages problem, which is the challenge presented in this talk. Then he discusses a generation one. Igor talks about a generation one, the rise of SPA, single page application, where as you click, you're not going back to the server every time. Now, this is kind of a primitive form of what we think about SPAs today. This is Ajax, jQuery, GWT, Google Web Toolkit, and even before Ajax, XML HTTP requests. So your back end still had the business rules, still had the logic, still had the data, but it didn't do the rendering. It would send JSON to the front end, and then this data, this JSON, would be rendered in the browser using JavaScript, using some templating system or just native calls or something like that. So you weren't sending HTML over the wire anymore. And Mario's point in there from HTMX, this is the beginning of the end. This is the kind of thing that we want to fight back against and return hypermedia to its rightful place. And one of the benefits of this generation one was it gave you immediate impact or immediate feedback on interaction. That's what they were looking for. You click a button and it like disables immediately, or it tells you immediately that you have to put an integer or something in there. I'm looking over to see if there are any questions or good points as I go along. Then we arrive at what Igor calls generation two, which learned from a lot of the either mistakes or friction from generation one. They wanted UX and DX scalability. From a UX scalability perspective, they wanted to tackle things like, and this is something Rich Harris makes fun of in GitHub about, you do something here and it fixes this box, but now this box on the page is out of date. Well, those two boxes are logically connected and they all need some state and dependency and stuff like that. So how do you express that? You hardwire it? No, you get a framework which handles that kind of stuff for you. And then developer experience. A lot of stuff went into these frameworks, I'll say in the last 5 years. Really Angular, React and Angular 2 really got the start on this, a formal concept of components that have props and do rendering and maybe have internal state and stuff like that. The rise of all things, freaking TypeScript, the JavaScript world, adopted typing, gradual typing, big shock. And then build optimization. This is the source of the joy and the pain. Things like Babel Webpack plugins, code splitting, putting your PNGs into your JavaScript bundle. People, come on. And then they kind of started to realize, well, we can't SEO that stuff anymore. And the first load and first paint slow. So we're going to do server-side rendering, kind of, but it's half broken and you still have to do everything twice because you have to rehydrate on the browser. And then this is where I would lovingly say from personal experience, things got real. Huge payloads. You're supposed to be making things faster and they're slower. So WTF. Every day you wake up and your entire stack is broken with 50 packages that say that they need funding and 10 packages that have severe security vulnerabilities. The whole tooling and JavaScript fatigue thing. So Igor talks about what's the next generation going to look like. And if you don't follow this closely, I will go ahead and let the cat out of the bag. These people are working hard and they are innovating like mad and they are doing things that are quite interesting. They're trying to get back to server-side rendering and still sending a component which hydrates in the browser and wakes up without all the penalties that they were paying for in generation 2. And in some cases, 0JS, that's what they call it. On the critical rendering path, you can pre-render on the server, get it on the page, and if that page doesn't need any of the interactive stuff, you don't pay for that tax. And there's this movement to things called islands, which is what I just talked about, or React server components. And I'd like you to take a look at that arrow, because this is what Igor is saying is the next generation of the web. JavaScript everywhere, JavaScript on the server, JavaScript is the web. So this talk is part of a series. 2019, Russell Keith McGee gave a Black Swans keynote at PyCon. Wonderful talk. One of his Black Swans was JavaScript is going to run us over because we don't have a presence in the browser. Lucas Longa gave a talk shortly thereafter at PyLondinium, a keynote. One of his points was this, same thing. We don't have a presence in the browser. People are demanding that. And we can't just ship Python over there. It's too big. Even if we WASM'd it, we can't just ship it over there. It's too big. It'll take too long to interpret. And if you care about energy usage around the world, we are consuming Google watts of energy just waking up a Python interpreter. And so a couple of years ago, I did this keynote. And so this is kind of revisiting it about those two keynotes and then adding my points and interpretation on it. You may notice I'm wearing the same shirt. This is my talk shirt. So since we last talked, what's happened since then? Kind of a refresher. A lot's happened, particularly in the JavaScript world. That whole generation 1, generation 2, generation 0, 1, 2, et cetera, static site generation, client-side rendering, server-side rendering. Now in this new world, Rich Harris calls transitional apps. Marco people are calling islands and stuff like that. All this innovation on pre-rendering. And this whole JavaScript tooling fatigue, which is just so real, they're actually tackling it. Things are happening to eliminate Babel, mostly eliminate Webpack. Things are going to get better over there. And so we can't just trust on forever and ever JavaScript sucking, because it's not going to suck forever and ever. When you look at Dino.js, for example. And when it's on the innovation front, whether it's the tooling or fixing the first rendering problem, critical rendering path problem, or related things like immutable stores and all that kind of stuff, it just feels like all these ships are coming into port for JavaScript everywhere, particularly on edge computing and cloud service workers, which I'll mention in a moment with Rich Harris. I'll look over. Yes, Eli does look like Anvil. Hey, Anvil was featured in here. I've Meredydd in a slide. Now, what's happened on the Python side since we last talked? Not so much. We haven't really considered changes in how we do server-side rendering. I'll dive into that specifically. The biggest bright spot is very much what Mario did with the slide over there, HTMX from Carson Gross, a way to get some of the benefits that you're looking for in a SPA without throwing out what I call the web. HTML, hypermedia, Helios, all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of times where we just say, WASM, we'll write in and save the day. Well, WASM is writing in. CPython 3.11 main branch right now, you can compile to WASM. And in fact, just 2 days ago, Christian put this tweet out. He's got a talk coming up. I guess it's in a week, if I can read something like that. Which if you feel deeply about this, maybe go see that talk. Just be careful, curb your enthusiasm about WASM. There are a number of things that have to happen for that to be a legitimate silver bullet. Yes, it is still huge. Yeah, but that actually brings up the point. There is a next step and a next step and a next step for us. We need to come out with like a micro Python profile or something like that, or even really innovative thoughts to have a tiny subset that only does templating or something like that. I'll go through some voices in JavaScript and then some voices in Python and then get into my voice at the end. So Rich Harris, creator of Rollup and now Svelte. He was with the New York Times. He's now at Vercel. He's got this great talk, Rethinking Reactivity, that he did a couple of years ago, which really influenced my thinking. And then earlier this year, I think, or late last year, he gave this talk at that link on transitional apps, multi-page apps to single-page apps to transitional apps. And he talked a little bit about the app web versus the document web, which is really the center point of my thesis on this. He claims that it's a false dichotomy because everything exists in the gray in between. I kind of disagree with him because if it does exist in the gray in between, most of it is in a gray part closer to the document web. And that we're really we're paying a lot of tax to pretend that we're complete apps. But what he and the next person want to do is give app-like experiences with the web. Nice transitions between pages and high interactivity and things like that. So he wants to do killer experiences, but he's got this line in there, oh God, it hurts, where he's like, I'm paraphrasing for effect, but he's like, war is over, JavaScript on the server is going to win. And all of y'all that say, no, I want to keep my Python, sucks to be you. Now, he didn't say any of that, but he kind of said all of that. Igor Minar, who I mentioned before in the Generation Zero, etc., formular head of Anger. He's now with Cloudflare, working on edge workers, kind of moving stuff that you would have done in the browser into something close to the browser, but not in your server room. He's passionate about the open web, and he feels like the open web matters. But what matters even more is delivering killer user experiences. And so he's also talking about the app web versus the doc web. And I think he actually uses those words as well. Jürgen, yes. Yes. Hey, Jürgen, I have an assignment for you. You need to go write the 5th generation right now. Okay. He gave the taxonomy I gave about framework generations. And his thesis is if we want to have better user experience, then all that tax that we're talking about is necessary because we need sophistication. And he gives deep analysis of the mechanics. And then he has a line in there about for the next generation JavaScript-based server-first architectures. Ugh. Ryan Carniato, somebody that I follow closely, has a lot of writing on Medium, deep dives in all the aspects of modern web, rendering and observability and immutability and all these other things and how they affect rendering performance. I'm a big fan. He just a couple of days ago gave an analysis of one of these key issues, hydration. How can I pre-render on the server, send something to the client and wake it up without paying a big tax? And if they can fix that problem, then they've eliminated one of their biggest problems. He claims in this article, hydration is a solved problem. Oop, not good for us. And then just last night, Ryan posted something. This sentence, he's talking about routing, the migration from to allow multi-page architectures to applications to have SPA-like routing, and React Server Components claims to be doing it, and Quick claims to be doing it, Marco 6 claims to be doing it. And so they're all trying to get what we like about multi-page architecture applications, what I call the web, and deliver it in the context of what people would think of as a SPA architecture. So just a quick look at this to see why I like this so much. This is a React plus TypeScript component. It tells you how to use it with things called props and expresses it in a type declaration. It could be an interface declaration. So the last line is a usage of that card, and it's passing in some props. And because of the typing and because of all of this, it's isolated, it's testable, it has good IDE tooling for autocomplete. It'll red squiggly you. You can run type checkers to find problems. Spiritually, it's aimed at developers, not designers. And our model of web rendering comes from the 1990s, frankly, where we built this side architecture aimed at designers to keep them away from the programming. This is a different implementation of that. Instead of JSX or TSX, it uses something called HTM, which is a tagged template. Think of it like a F string that has superpowers that goes through some processing during rendering. And with this is a complete page. You don't have to run it through some transpiler or something like that. It's pretty lightweight. But importantly, it treats the template as part of the language. Just like an F string, in the middle of it, you can autocomplete and get red squigglies and stuff like that. So things I like about this React plus TypeScript component-driven development model is that it's aimed at development. It's aimed at developers. It feels like part of development. It feels like something I would write tests for. It would have sane scopes. Oh my God, Jinja 2, where does that variable come from? You'll never know. Symbols that you import, autocomplete, red squiggly. I want to refactor or rename something. It'll go find this symbol, whether it's in the template or the JavaScript. All these other tooling things, it feels like development. I can even do advanced things like Storybook as part of my development lifecycle. HyperCard forever. But I ask, is this the web? SPAs, React, TypeScript, Webpack 57 plugins, JavaScript over the wire. View source? Is this the web? So I'm a web originalist. I think that the web does mean something. I don't think it's distributed Visual Basic, damn it. I don't think it's a JavaScript VM running in bunches of browsers worldwide. I think you should be able to view source. I think it's primarily document-oriented, at least 80-20. I think it's HTML, CSS, PNG, and JavaScript as separate things delivered over HTTP. I just want HTML plus a little bit more. Here we step in. Carson Gross, who has taken up the mantle of that argument, that insurrection, counter-reformation. He's a creator of a package called HTMX and a companion package called Hyperscript. He is an advocate for the original REST model of hypermedia, and let's do more with HTML. So the idea is you just leave little things in your HTML declarative, and he's written the JavaScript so you don't have to. And if you want little things to update and trigger other things, it's all declarative. I feel like HTMX has given not just Python, but all these other languages a new lease on life for the document web story. It's really caught on in Python. Why? Because of Adam Johnson, who seems to do, he's one of the people that I follow on Twitter very carefully. Seems to do just about everything in Django. The dude is prolific. It just bugs the crap out of me. He does more, in the first 5 minutes of the day than I do in a week. And he created a package called Django HTMX, which integrates, I'll try and be good about this. It integrates HTMX into Django templates and then goes a step beyond so that if all you want is that little piece from the server, you can get just that little piece and not have to re-render the entire screen, but you also don't have to fetch the full page of HTML from the server. Looking over comments. All right, our friend forever, Chrissy Wainwright. We all know her from Plone, also from Django. She's been in, I was thinking back to WebLion. I think I've got the name right, at Penn State, and Chrissy giving all those tutorials on theming and CSS and design and stuff like that. Drummer and American Ninja Warrior aspirant. And she gave me her comments on this, and she actually feels that the front end should be left to JavaScript, but keep it lightweight, likes the direction of HTMX. And on an important point, she and I swapped some emails on this. Chrissy, if you're in, you can tell me if I got this right. But there was a trend for a while to move CSS kinds of animation thingies and transitions into JavaScript because it was more expressive. But the CSS standards are actually catching up on that and getting implemented in browsers. So you can get back out that part of what you were looking for with SPAs and get probably hardware acceleration on this. Okay, on to Meredydd, who I believe has already spoken, I think. But I remember him from previous Python web conferences and seeing him at PyBay and talking about Anvil, which is it really, at least us from his open Plone background, a really innovative take on this, that there is the problem about all the tooling and the frameworks and the complexity and the bugs and all that. But there's this other problem that you have all these representations of your business entities in the database and in your queries and in your view models and your views and your components, blah, 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 blah. And they're all in different technologies, different frameworks and stuff like that. So there's leakage of abstractions everywhere. It's better to join things up. It wouldn't be great if you could do Python basically end to end with this. And so Anvil takes that model and does some transpiling of server generated stuff to JavaScript without paying the 10 megabyte WASM tax. The payloads are pretty tight. He's looked at HTMX, feels it's promising, but I guess as you get more out of the document web into the app web, you start to run out of road and find the places where it's not a good fit. Speaking of not a good fit, Lawrence Rowe, who really is one of the people, when I have a hard question, I go to Lawrence because he is, some people are just naturally gifted at architecture and design. Chris McDonough is one of those. Lawrence is the same, longtime friend of ours from Plone and Python, has been doing big systems for a long time, including JavaScript. And he's also kind of a fan of doing more in JavaScript on the front end. So a little bit of a contrarian position versus me, and feels like we just need Python to do the parts that Python's good at. And that if we try to think in terms of trying to get Python in the browser, page weight matters because it already matters for JavaScript. And if we want to swap in Python for where JavaScript is right now, you're going to hit some things like memory management that really become, and Lucas Longa talked about that as well, that really become a limitation for that view of we can just swap Python in the future with WebAssembly. Jeff Triplett, another person, as well as the next person that I follow very closely on Twitter, another very prolific person. And Jeff's point was very prolific in Django. Jeff's point was this fatigue that everyone's feeling by moving their UI from the server to the browser is torture. It is really limiting and demotivating. And you find developers eagerly bailing out on that and jumping over to back to HTML, as he put it, which kind of implies also a little bit of HTMX. He makes this point that Simon's also going to make, that single page applications, you know, they're sexy in that prototype. They're sexy in the demo to the C-suite. But living with them is misery. They're hard to develop. They're slower to develop, harder to build. And then living with them, I swear to God, I've got a Gatsby application. If I walk away from it for a month and come back, I don't expect it to work. If I do, you know, update my packages, it will be broken. And I will spend most of my day repairing things. And so he feels like HTMX and Alpine is a positive step. Alpine is a small JavaScript library that lets you, kind of like HTMX, locality of behavior, Put something there and just there, and not convert your entire page into a JavaScript framework. He feels like WebAssembly has strategic potential, therefore we can't miss the chance, but let's understand a lot of work has to get done to make this viable for browsers. Jeff is right. Okay. All right. Looking over at Waylon. Yes, Waylon. Thank you. All right. I declare Waylon to be the winner. He's correct. He jumped eagerly back to plain old HTML and CSS, which is also, I believe, Simon's point. We have, according to Simon, a decade of deep experience with single page applications, and the verdict is in. It hurts. It doesn't always give you what it says it does. In fact, it gives you the opposite. And now we have an entire generation of front-end developers who think that React is the one way to put a UI on the web. So Simon's point is, we're starting to come up with a counter argument, and we need to dig in and be louder about it. If you want to write Figma, which is basically a desktop app in a browser, use a single page application. Otherwise, think long and hard about it. He feels like, Simon feels like the HTMX pattern is a positive sign. He wants us to keep in mind accessibility. He's right. We don't talk, it's still an afterthought in this stage where we're all trying to prototype and learn about HTMX as HTML++. ASCII, asynchronous server gateway interface, he feels like is a bright spot. And kind of as an aside, there's this push for streamed HTML. Ryan Carniato is talking about this as the big leap. And Python needs a better story for streaming, and ASCII might be it. He feels like the most exciting new thing on the horizon is computing at the edge, where things that before we thought of computing at the edge as things that we would have run on our server will run closer to the browser. This flips it and says things that we would have run in the browser, we're going to run at the edge, where you don't have to do transfers of a 10 megabyte WASM file. You don't have to, maybe you have a SQLite database right there. And Simon, if you haven't looked at his data set and his data set for desktop, you need to look at it. It is, Calvin, you were talking about HyperCard. Somebody needs to make a HyperCard for data set. So what are some of my takeaways from the voices in JavaScript and the voices on the Python side and the voices in the Slack channel right now? The web matters. And because the web matters, I hope that's not controversial. The web matters. Mozilla matters. The open web matters. Because the web matters, we should be really careful about what is the web. Expanding the definition to mean anything that delivers a better user experience. Well, maybe it does, and maybe that is what people want, but don't call it the web. I personally feel like REST, as defined by Roy Fielding, that's the web. And I think Roy was pretty clear. He thinks of HTML and hypermedia as the engine of application state. And so we should advocate for that position for practical reasons, for purity reasons, for definitional reasons. But we should also not be content to just do things the way we were doing them in the late 90s. We need to try and scratch a little bit of the SPA itch, a little bit of the app web itch with HTML++ and with fresh thinking in our server rendering ideas and architecture so that we can deliver some of those modern web experiences. There's a lot that could be done. It isn't just at WASM, MicroPython, it's in server components and developer experience. But there's also a lot that could be lost. If we take a pass and don't do this stuff, we'll wake up in a day where JavaScript on the web is everywhere. And so there isn't enough consensus yet, I think, in Python land. So I will close out a little bit with my dream a little dream of what things would be like in some modern web version, and just one slice of it, not the whole WASM stuff, just one slice of it. If modern Python web development was informed by modern front-end development and looked a lot more like modern front-end development that was aimed at developers instead of designers. So let me tell a little science fiction story about Python and the modern web. And I'll pause here for a moment, look in the channel. Oh, sorry, Club Run, Cloud Run, you're right, apologies. Fun fact, 15 minutes before my presentation, I realized I hadn't typed that slide in. And so that's why there's an error on that. Apologies. Yes, I would like to go to a spa with little cucumber sandwiches. All right. Nice slide, David, for the web originalist. Am I the spider or the fly in this morality tale, David? Okay. Let's talk about a lowly to-do component. And this is pretty familiar on the React and TSX side. And I think I pasted some code earlier that was similar to that. If I was in Python, how would I approach this? Well, I'd write a Jinja 2 template. But it's missing some stuff. Where's the logic? Oh, it's over in the view. Good luck finding it. Where's the state? It is fill in the blank. You'll never find it. Styling, well, it's over in some CSS that might be in some magically named directory. Who's calling it? You'll never know, because these are magic strings. And if we want to talk about autocomplete, well, all this modern development stuff, you just have to hope that your IDE wrote some custom glue between that Jinja template and the framework that was using it. Sphinx, never. You will never find in a Sphinx template where that symbol came from. I mean, never, never. Apologies, Waylon, I didn't mean Club Run, I meant Cloud Run. Apologies. Now, let's go back and look at what this would look like in modern front end. And instead of using JSX, TSX, I'll use that HTML example, which uses JavaScript tagged templates to put the template directly in a programming language native string that gets superpowers added to it. And because it's a string in the middle of a function, in the middle of a module, it gets access to the scope and all that kind of stuff. So instead, we would have a template with an F string. And we don't have tag templates in Python. Jim Baker of Jython fame is working on this. There's been a lot of poo-pooing of this. They don't see the point. Well, that's the point right there. So there is an existence proof for why this will be helpful. It's an F string. So you can get autocomplete on label and you can get curly brackets because it's in the Python language. You can put it in a callable component, just like we had in the React component. Any kind of callable, you can pass arguments to it. It would return stuff, and we will call that a nice little unit known as a component that has props. With typing, I wonder how much, I mean, you can't do any of that crap in a Jinja 2 template. You have normal Python scopes. I could take the template out, put it in a variable, and get autocomplete on the symbol template. I could do an import of that component, that subcomponent, into another component. It's just another import. It's not some magical leave it in the macros or under templates folder. It's explicit, not implicit. And then I can get autocomplete in my code. This one's a little bit trickier because it's yeah, I think it is it not? Yeah, this one might be a little bit trickier because it's a little bit past F strings. It's in the HTML function. If you haven't figured this out right now, this exists, and I paid someone in Japan to write a PyCharm plugin to get HTML strings to have the superpowers. You can pass props. So this is using the to-do component from the to-do list component, just like in React plus HTML. It's a callable. You're calling it. There's no magic thing in between. It's not like your Jinja 2 is translated to an AST, which is translated to Python code, and there's all this abstraction leaking in between. And I can get autocomplete and all of that. And as you get into the problems of React components and you have props all the way down, you could have a thread local context or hooks or something like that. Callable doesn't have to be a function. It could be a data class. This is the exact same concept. And with that, you could borrow from Angular and have dependency injection so that you didn't have prop drilling all the way down. You can have really smart injection. This looks a little bit like RxJS, where I say, I just want the string, and you're getting a much smaller surface area for your component. And it also means that you could, when you use this component, you could pass in just customer name. You don't have to pass in the entire thing and have that usage not go to injection. And then for all my Zopi Plony friends out there, or Pyramid, you could have components that were added into a site, replaced a component in a site like the logo, replace the logo, but only on this page for this kind of thing, et cetera, like that. This stuff is all dead simple to test in PyTest. This is testing the rendering of a component that's a function. This is testing the rendering of a data class where you can do the first part to get the scope for the template, and then a second test that tests the result of the rendering. Then we get into bigger things, a little bit like what Simon and Jeff are talking about, trying to get into scratching the itches that people want for the app web. We could have layouts that mimic the PRPL purple concept of app shells, header, footer, sidebar, content, so that only the important parts of the page changed. You could have a component framework which worked across Django, Flask, Jinja 2, Chameleon, whatever, was kind of neutral to the underlying system by putting things in services. I'm doing that with Sphinx. We could bring back lightweight themes where you just write some HTML in a rule file. And then take all of that, translate it into HTMX, and give us HTML++, where going from page to page doesn't redraw the whole thing. It only fills in the appropriate blanks and only gets the minimal needed from the server. You could get Storybook and write little stories so you have a pleasant development experience to let people review it. With actual hot reloading, our hot reloading story right now is really kind of like the live reload thing, just as a fork and a full page reload. So it's kind of slow, kind of messy. Going completely blue sky, you can take all that stuff I just said and assemble in the browser, client-side page assembly to get just this piece, that piece during a transition. Go even further, tap into this new, it's going to be big, streaming of HTML fragments, and then translate that to progressive web applications that are offline first. And you could do that in an edge service, the way Simon and Jeff are talking about, where Python in WASM is doing some of the work for you. And then if that works, hell, move it back into the browser and do client-side rendering. Point that entire gun at Sphinx and read the docs to beat Medium and suck all that money back into the Python ecosystem with ethical ads, all from a lowly to-do component. I've done a lot of this 5 times, thrown it out, started over. I'm not that good at this, but it's doable. Something exciting can be done. Thanks, everybody.